Lovely to be back, and I'm just going to share screen. Yeah, that's good. You've got it? Yep.
Perfect.
Okay, good. So it's great to be back with you guys. Just before you came on, I was talking with Debbie. We've taken as a country another step towards easing the restrictions. Swimming pools open today. Tomorrow night, people are having services in synagogues, no more than 50 people. So we're taking some steps in those directions, but we're not going to be focusing on Corona. We're going to be focusing on the great city of Jerusalem. And the image that you see ahead in front of you is kind of the iconic Jerusalem scene. It's the scene you're going to see on many, many postcards. You see the Kotel, the Western Wall. You see the Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock. You see the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in the background, just the top of the Mount of Olives. This is the classic Jerusalem scene. But before we get to this scene, we're going to go back in history to understand why the scene somehow tugs on our heartstrings, how this got to be. So we're going to get on our bus. You can see again some familiar faces. And of course, a familiar orange bus. I don't know, every time I've worked with a group from Mirage, we've always been on an orange Gershon bus. So we're on the bus and we're off to Jerusalem. Now, last week we were in the Negev, and it's great, and I love the Negev, but when you go to Jerusalem, Jerusalem is something that we have been commanded to remember. And whether it is at a wedding, where traditionally it was the role of the groom to break a cup. Today, sometimes at weddings, both the bride and the groom, or both the grooms or both the brides get to break the cup. But also at the Pesach Seder, where if we manage to get all the way to the end of the Seder, we end the Seder by saying, next year in Jerusalem. And for those of you that might have made it to the very end of the Yom Kippur service, and you're in the synagogue after the shofar is blown, and just before you go home to eat, once again we say, next year in Jerusalem. Elie Wiesel says, the writer Elie Wiesel says that the first time we come to Jerusalem, it's as if we've always been there. And every other time we come to Jerusalem, it's as if for the very first time. And I think the reason is because we carry this emotional baggage. We've been saying next year in Jerusalem, sometimes for many, many years. And of course, once one's been to Jerusalem, the need to be back in Jerusalem is there as well. So one visits Jerusalem when one arrives in Jerusalem. Because of this, it is traditional to say a blessing. It is traditional to stand on one of the hills looking out onto the city of Jerusalem. This is a vantage point taken from the Mount of Olives. And what traditionally we do is with wine. It's too late for wine for me, so I've got some tea, and probably too early for wine for you. But the blessing that one says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechiyanu v'kiyimanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who's granted us life, sustained us, and enabled us to reach this occasion. Now, this is a traditional prayer that we say in Judaism at significant moments. You say it at a Brit Milah, you say it at a wedding, you say it at a Bar Mitzvah, you say it at those significant moments. We say it once a year when we sit in the Sukkah, but there's only one place where our tradition tells us we should say it, and that place is Jerusalem. And the reason is that Jerusalem is in our memories, like we looked before, from the weddings and from the Pesach Seder and so on. Jerusalem is also the city that is mentioned many, many times in the Tanakh. And I'm using the word Tanakh here for the Hebrew Bible, not just Torah. Tanakh is actually an acronym. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Jerusalem's not mentioned in the Torah. It's not mentioned in the first 5 books. But then it makes up for it by being mentioned innumerable times in the rest of the books going forward. And They tell us a story. And what we're going to do is tell just a little bit of that story of Jerusalem as we make our way around Jerusalem today. What you can see in the image is a mosaic. That's actually the mosaic that appears on the floor of a synagogue in a place called Beit Alpha up in Galilee. But it defines an event that happened on a mountain called Mount Moriah. On Mount Moriah, according to our tradition, there is a stone, a rock, upon which God creates the world. And a little bit later, in Genesis 22, that piece of Bible that we read in the regular Torah cycle and on Rosh Hashanah, and that is in the traditional prayer book every day, tells us the story of Abraham taking his beloved son Isaac to Mount Moriah in order to sacrifice him. And yet in the end, Abraham does not sacrifice his son Isaac, and they go down the hill together after Abraham has anointed that place as a holy place. A generation later, Jacob comes back, fleeing, and he puts down his head to sleep, and in his dreams there is a ladder ascending to heaven and angels going up and down the ladder. Once again, in our tradition, that is Mount Moriah. And the golden dome that we saw just a minute before, the western wall that we saw just a little earlier, are on Mount Moriah today. So according to our tradition, this is a pivotal point of our story. And again, however you read the Bible, people of faith who read the Bible literally, people who see the Bible as a book of inspiration, and those of you that read the Bible simply to glean the historical or the geographical clues from it, however you choose to read the Bible, the focus is on Jerusalem and on Mount Moriah. But that doesn't explain why there would be a city there. Because when the stories, there was no city there. Abraham comes to a place, we don't hear of a city there. But when David comes to conquer the city that David conquers is the small area marked in purple over here. We call that the city of David today. That was a small Canaanite city, scholars say between 900 and 1,500 people. As many people in the city of David as were in my high school. That's how small the city was. Why was there a city there at all? Because three things overlap. And those that have been with me in Israel will be able to tell you what these three things are, because I emphasize them: water, defense, and access. If there is no spring, no permanent source of water, there is no permanent city. Then you're nomads, like Abraham was, like Sarah was. In order for there to be a city, there needs to be a spring. And if you look where the arrow is pointing, you can see the Gihon spring, which is a major, major spring until today in the city of David, on the outskirts of the city of Jerusalem of today. The second thing that you need is it needs to be defendable. And Jerusalem is a city on the hills. There is no way to have a city that is not defendable. Again, nomads pack their bags and run away when an enemy comes. If you build a city and you settle down, you are vulnerable if there is no wall. So it needs to be defendable, it needs to be on a hill. But it can't be too defendable. It needs to be accessible. The market has to arrive, food, goods, ideas, news has to arrive at the city. Jerusalem has all three of these facilities. Now, I just want to draw your attention, because we're going to be talking about it after. The city of David, marked in purple, will expand northwards under Solomon to include this hill, which we'll get to in a moment. But this white line, this faded white line that you see over here that I'm drawing your attention to, that's the borders of the old city today. So the old city today doesn't even include the area of the city of David. the old city of Jerusalem moved. And the reason is because, unfortunately, Jerusalem has been built and destroyed and built and destroyed and built and destroyed time and time and time again. Now, the Bible tells us that David conquers the city by creeping through a pipe, a channel that carried the water from the spring into the city, and conquered the city. But he then finds the owner of this hill, buys this piece of land from him in order to build a temple. And according to the Bible, he's not allowed to build a temple because he's got blood on his hands. He's broken 3 of the big 10. He's coveted another man's wife. He's committed adultery. And then he's had that wife's husband dispatched. But the son of that union, Solomon, will get to build the temple over here on this mountain. Now, it's a tiny, tiny city. And in fact, this image is of the city of once again, the 900 to 1,500 people. Up on this barren hill is where the temple will be built. But this city takes on much, much greater significance than any other city in the land of Israel, and many would say than any other city, because of the stories that are going to go out of the city. And once Solomon's temple is built, we will have a period of thriving, and then the kingdom will split, and then we will have, after Solomon's great temple, and after the kingdom grows enormously, we will come under a destruction from Babylon. Now, just a little footnote. When we come to Jerusalem, we see many, many remains. We see hardly any remains from the time of Solomon. Until last week, I would have said we have no absolutely verifiable remains of the temple. But last week, they found something that they believe is attributable to the first temple of King Solomon. So even in this crazy time, and even in the city that they've been digging in and digging in and digging in and digging in, for more than 100 years, they're still finding things. The city of Solomon's is destroyed, and it's destroyed on a day called the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. Earlier, I spoke about how many people have this memory of Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem, how Jerusalem needs to be such an integral part of who we are. And that's because for many of us, the 9th of Av is a day of mourning. It's the day that the city is destroyed. And on that day that the city is destroyed, we go to exile in Babylon. And you may know the tune from Boney M, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. Or maybe you know the who was it? Don McLean? By the waters of Babylon. That's actually Psalm 137 that tells the story of our exile from Jerusalem. And there are many scholars who say that people were ambivalent about Jerusalem when Jerusalem stood. Certainly the people who lived in Jerusalem loved Jerusalem, but the people who lived in other parts of the country, maybe they were resentful to Jerusalem. They didn't have a clear-cut image of Jerusalem. But once we go to the exile, Jerusalem becomes the place that people long to return to. And of course, when they can, and 70 years later they come back to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem. And what you can see over here is an image of what Jerusalem looks like in the year 70. Now, this is a model of Jerusalem that stands today at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. In the background, you can see, of course, much more of Jerusalem. This is the Givat Ram University campus, and up in the distance over there on the hill is Mount Herzl. But in the foreground is the city of Jerusalem, which in the year 70 was a city of more than 100,000 people. making it one of the largest cities in the classical world. And the focal point of that city was the temple. Now, earlier on, we stood on the Temple Mountain, we saw the Golden Dome. We said Shechianu together. The Golden Dome stands more or less where this temple stood. And the Western Wall, just to orient you, the Kotel that we saw in the very opening slide would be where the arrow is now, but on the other side. Down below, you're kind of coming down from these red roofs towards the wall. Over there is the Western Wall. And that's the last remnant that we have of this great city. Because once again, on the 9th day of Av, on Tisha B'Av, this time in the year 70, once again, the city is destroyed. This image shows us excavations that have been taken, just what we call the southern wall. The Kotel, the Western Wall, would be, if we could remove this wall over here, it would be directly on the other side of that. This is a street. This wall is part of the Western Wall. And I want to draw your attention to these piles of rocks. These are rocks that were knocked down on the 9th day of Av in the year 70, when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. This compound today, the Southern Wall excavation, is called the Davidson Center. The Davidson Center, Bill Davidson, who used to own the Detroit Pistons, sponsored an excavation which allowed this to be exposed so that we can see street level. This is the street that the pilgrims would have walked on. These storefronts that you see over here are the places that perhaps they bought their sacrifices, or where they changed their money. And they had to change money because same as you have to change money when you go to a new city, but for them, one of the problems with Roman money is the same as the problem with American money. There's a human image on it. And the second commandment, as was understood by the Jews of Second Temple period Jerusalem, meant you couldn't have an image of a human on your coin, certainly not a coin you were going to be paying your tithe to the temple in. So these are the stores of the money changers. By the way, for those of you that have had a Christian education, this is a street that Jesus would have walked along. The temple was up at the top, but this is where people did their, this is where the food court was. This is where the money changer was. This is where life went on. Now, notice where the arrow is. That's ground level. Until 1967, ground level ran from there all the way across to the wall. This was all underground until post 6-Day War allowed us to excavate in this area. And the truth is that after the destruction, we once again are in exile. And when we are in exile, we don't come back to the land of Israel. Instead, we dive into text. And the texts that are written, and I've chosen a small piece from Tosefta Brachot, which is an early, very, very early layer of text, and it's a discussion about how to pray. Now, it's not telling people how to pray physically or what to say. It's telling them which direction they need to face when they pray. Those that are standing outside of the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards the land of Israel, and only then pray, as it is said. I'm going to leave out the quotes. Those that are standing in the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards Jerusalem, and only then pray. Those that are standing in Jerusalem should direct their hearts towards the temple, as it is said. Those that are standing inside the temple should direct their hearts towards the Holy of Holies, and only then pray. Our compass as a Jewish people is oriented to Jerusalem. And that was a conscious decision that the rabbis took once again when we were no longer in Jerusalem. Like Babylonian exile directs us towards Jerusalem, the rabbis of the Talmud make it all the more focused. When I grew up in South Africa, in Johannesburg, every synagogue faces north, because all synagogues are built oriented towards Jerusalem. And when I've been to synagogues in the United States, they faced east because they faced to Jerusalem. And I've not yet been to synagogue in Norway, but I've been to synagogues in, in other parts of Europe, and they face south because Jerusalem sits at the focus. So in addition to the Talmud, or even the name, there was a Talmud written in Babylon. We call it the Babylonian Talmud. There was a Talmud written in Galilee. They don't call it the Galilee Talmud. They call it the Jerusalem Talmud because Jerusalem is the focal point. And that focal point, we go back to the slide we saw before of the family at the wedding or sitting around the Pesach table, was all about making sure that when we come to Jerusalem, we say, wow, we say Shechianu, as we did. Now, while we were in exile from Jerusalem, the city continues to be a city of significance. And the image that you're seeing is a church called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built at the site that the pre-Reformation Christian denominations recognize as the place of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now remember, Jesus is a Jew. He is crucified in Jerusalem by the Romans. He's buried outside Jerusalem. This is one of the clues as to why the walls of Jerusalem move. Because at the time of the crucifixion, this is not in the walls of the city. But later on, this becomes a focal point for Christian Jerusalem, part of the reason why the walls are going to move to incorporate this area. The Christians will build a church here in the 4th century. That church will be destroyed by the Muslims. And the church that you're seeing is rebuilt by the Crusaders in the 1100s. So Jerusalem becomes, it's been a focal point for the Jews, but it becomes also a focal point for Christians. And this is the center of the focal point. There are many other churches and many other sites of Christian significance. This is the most important one. And of course, as we've already seen, Jerusalem becomes an important city for Islam. The Muslim tradition connected to Jerusalem is mentioned in chapter 17 of the Quran. In chapter 17 of the Quran, Muhammad makes a midnight journey from his sacred mosque, which is how the Quran refers to Makkah, to the distant mosque, to the edge, Al-Aqsa, mentioned only once, and recognized, identified by Muslims as this hill, the same sacred hill that in our tradition, Abraham doesn't sacrifice Isaac, but in the Muslim tradition, it's his firstborn that isn't sacrificed. It's Ishmael, but it's the same hill. It's the same holy site. And just by the way, in the Christian tradition, the sacrifice was what went on in that church we just saw. It was Jesus that is actually sacrificed because Isaac is not sacrificed by Abraham. The point is that Jerusalem, while we're not here physically, we might be longing for Jerusalem. We might be saying next year in Jerusalem, Jerusalem becomes a holy city to two other faiths. All three faiths put Jerusalem as a very important city. And as a result, this city at the edge of the desert, the city with a small number of people, will grow and grow both physically into a larger city, but also in the psyche. There is a hymn in England, in Britain, called Jerusalem. It was proposed to be the anthem of Britain. Barcelona is a wonderful city. Nobody learns about Barcelona in Sunday school. People learn about Jerusalem in Sunday school, whether they're Jewish or Christian or Muslim. And that's why we said, wow, that's why we said Shechianu when we walked in, because that's the city. Now, back to the Jewish story. Jewish nationalism emerges as an articulated movement in the late 1800s. And it's led by the gentleman that you see in the picture with the beard, Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl wants a Jewish state. He thinks that it's paramount for the survival of the Jewish people, but Herzl himself is not overly Jewish. He comes from a very assimilated background. He doesn't care where it is. He toys with the idea of Uganda when it's offered to him by the British. But the rest of his movement, the rank and file members of the Zionist movement, will not consider anywhere else. In fact, they name the movement Zionism. It's not Herzl's name. And Zion is another name for Jerusalem. And so the very movement of return is not an empty, its name is not a name empty of meaning. It is a name that certainly for the generation that called it initially would have been very familiar with the term Zion. Every time the Torah is taken out of the ark, they would have sung, Ki mitzion titei Torah. Out of Zion will come the Torah. This is something that would have resonated for them, and it was pretty obvious to the Zionists that they were coming back to Jerusalem. Coming back from that same exile that was begun all the way back in the year 70 with the Romans' destruction of Jerusalem. Now, it's been a long, long time coming, and frankly, Jerusalem is not the focus of where the Zionist activity is. They're busy buying land in the Galilee and in the Negev and building Tel Aviv and settling, but the sentimental attachment to Jerusalem, the memory that they shouted it at Pesach every year, is absolutely there. And the culmination, it seems, of the Zionist movement is an event that will take place on the 29th of November, 1947. And I've called the slide Zionism without Zion. The image that you are seeing is the plan that was voted on at the United Nations on the 29th of November, 1947. The partition of Palestine into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. It's a terrible map. If you look at the map, it's a difficult map to be workable under the best of circumstances. Now, I'm always reminded that I was once in a bar in Belgium, and at a certain point in time, if you wanted to order a drink, you had to move to somewhere else in the bar because part of the bar was in Belgium and part of the bar was in Holland, and they have different hours that you could still order alcohol. That was not the reality of the land of Israel. And so the peach color was to be the Arab state, apricot color, I don't know, that orangey color. And the blue color, which is, as you can see, mostly desert, was to be the Jewish state. It's a terrible map. We said yes. We said yes, it's November 1947. It's just after the Holocaust. We have people still languishing in displaced persons camp. We say yes, and we accept the map. But I want to draw your attention to something that is often glossed over. It was not dividing the country into two. It was dividing the country into three. Because this white blob that you see over here was a corpus separatum, a separate corporate entity, a place that was not part of the Jewish state or the Arab state, a place that was going to be an international state, an international city. And part of the reason was because the Christian powers of Europe were not happy giving Jerusalem to the Jews or to the Muslims. But part of the problem was that the Jews wanted it all and the Muslims wanted it all, and the Christians wanted it all, so they just left it as an international city. Zion was left out of the map that was given to the Zionists. Now, of course, this was not the map that we have at the end of the war. During the War of Independence, a corridor is opened from the coast to Jerusalem, and that corridor enables Israel to hold on to Jerusalem, which was 1/6 of the population of the city. 1/6 of the population of the country was in Jerusalem, and it's a very, very narrow corridor. So what you can see in the map at the top is this narrow little corridor, which does not include the old city. The old city is just beyond a border. The city is literally divided in half by these barriers that we can see that run across the city. I have a colleague who grew up in a neighborhood right near the border. He was the younger brother. He used to get sent into no man's land to get the ball when it got kicked into no man's land. That's a divided city. You could smell the cooking across the border. It's not a tenable border, but it's the reality that we have from 1948 to 1967. And between 48 and 67, Jerusalem becomes the capital of Israel, even though the holy mountain, the holy old city, is not included. And even though it is only a few miles from the border, Israel builds a parliament building. What you can see here on the top is the Knesset, our parliament building, and the emblem of the state of Israel, the menorah, which stands in front of the Knesset. And what you can see down below is the Shrine of the Book. The Shrine of the Book, which is part of the Israel Museum, which houses the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can actually see from the other side of the Knesset, you can see the Shrine of the Book, or from the Shrine of the Book, you can see the other side of the Knesset, both at this new focal point. We don't have access to the Holy City. And so Israel's parliament is built here, and Israel's repository of our culture, of our history, of all the magnificent archaeological finds, and of Jewish life from 2,000 years of diaspora are housed in the magnificent Israel Museum. And so, undaunted by the fact that they are a few miles from the border, leadership begins to build and develop the western part of the city. David Ben-Gurion also creates an alternative holy mountain. And Ben-Gurion is often compared to Washington as the sort of visionary founding father of the state of Israel. But he was also in many ways Jefferson. He was also the guy who understood symbolism. And it's Ben-Gurion who will create an alternative holy mountain to the holy mountain that we have no access to, an alternative holy mountain to the Mount Moriah temple site. And he does this by exhuming the body of Theodor Herzl that has been buried in Vienna and untouched throughout the Holocaust, brings that body over and buries it on a hill on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. And that hill becomes known as Mount Herzl. And on that hill, once a year, begins the national celebration of independence. Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, happens on this hill in front of the tomb of Herzl. This alternative holy mountain is also Israel's Arlington, Israel's national military cemetery. And of course, fallen soldiers can be buried wherever their families would like them to be buried, on their kibbutz or their city in the north or the south of the country. But the national cemetery is on this same hill. Now, I use the word holy mountain symbolically, but I will remind you that the focal point of the temple was the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the focal point of this alternative mountain is 3 days. Independence Day on Mount Herzl, which is the last of those days. Memorial Day for fallen soldiers, which we commemorate the day before Independence Day. Understanding completely that our independence was paid by these soldiers. And on the other side of that same hill, they build Yad Vashem. That mountain is now known as the Mountain of Memory. If you want to talk about it sort of schematically, at the top of the hill, we have the dreamer, Theodor Herzl. On the eastern slopes of the hill, we have the military cemetery, those who paid the price of the dream. And on the western side of the hill, we have Yad Vashem, those who never saw the dream. Yad Vashem, our national memorial, monument, and museum and archive to the destruction of 6 million Jews in Europe by the Nazis during World War II. Those 3 sites are also on our calendar. Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, a week later, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, the following day, Independence Day, each with a ceremony, each, except this year, in the presence of large crowds, with the president and the prime minister and the speaker of the House and the chief of staff and the head justice. Ben-Gurion creates an alternative focal point. Now, one of the paradoxes about Ben-Gurion is he is passionate and knowledgeable about Bible, but he is deeply secular. Ben-Gurion is not interested in the Temple Mount as a focal point. Ben-Gurion is interested in creating these modern sites that tell a different story, the modern Jewish story. Herzl and Zionism, the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, and the people who paid the ultimate sacrifice, and the Holocaust. This is the significant mountain, and that is the situation until 1967. Now, those sites remain important until today, but in 1967, there is a war, which we call the Six-Day War. And the Six-Day War, in June of 1967, the Six-Day War leads Israel to conquer the Sinai Peninsula and down south, the Golan Heights up north. We'll talk about that next week. But also what we call East Jerusalem. And the area marked over here in the shaded area is East Jerusalem. The old city at its core, but the big Arab neighborhoods around Jerusalem. And we see what was West Jerusalem, the dotted line coming in, and suddenly the city more than doubles in population. And it gets a lot more complicated. On the one hand, we now have access to the old city. We are now able to visit the sites and, as I mentioned, excavate the sites that had been buried for thousands of years. But on the other hand, it gets to be a lot more politically complicated. Because we have one city, two peoples, and three religions. This is another version of the map we saw before. We see the green line, which is what was pre-67 Israel. We see the red line, which is the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, including those East Jerusalem neighborhoods that were taken by Israel. But this is made more complicated because if you look at the map, you'll see green blobs and blue blobs. The blue blobs are Jewish neighborhoods. The green blobs are Arab neighborhoods. And you'll see I'm not talking about the area that was Jerusalem before 67, which is all a Jewish city, but I'm talking about beyond the borders, all these new Jewish neighborhoods, and also within the borders of Jerusalem, all of these Arab neighborhoods that are included in the city. And people often ask me when we're touring around Jerusalem, and we've been there a couple of days, people say, Muki, how many people live in Jerusalem? And it's a difficult question to answer, because where do you draw the line?
Muki, I think
Because
you're on mute.
I am? Hang on.
I can hear me, Muki, fine, Debbie.
Yeah.
I can hear him too.
I'm
Sorry,
Yeah,
then it's my internet connection. I apologize.
I'm not on mute. I don't know. I'm not on mute.
All right, I apologize. My internet
Okay.
went down.
No problem. So what was I saying? The population of Jerusalem, it's much more complicated with the numbers. Arabs, Palestinians would count certain areas as Jerusalem and not count other areas. Jews would count certain areas and not count other areas. Right-wing Jews would count certain ways. Left-wing Jews would count certain ways. Jerusalem has become a lot more complicated. Now, the picture that you can see here is a picture of two clearly Muslim Arab women with their children. And they are not citizens of Israel, but they are residents of Jerusalem. All of the people living in these green neighborhoods that you see are residents of Jerusalem, work in the hotel that you'd be staying at, or in the pharmacy that you'd be buying medicine in, or in the hospital that is treating our ill at the moment, but they're not, most of them have chosen not to accept citizenship. And that makes Jerusalem very complicated. It makes it complicated because I've spent 45 minutes talking about our longing for Jerusalem, the Jewish longing for Jerusalem, and there are a whole lot of other people with a different story and a different longing, and they have to kind of get along in Jerusalem. And that makes it a complicated city. On the one hand, I just said the wait staff in most of the hotels are Arabs, and Jews and Arabs get on just fine on a day-to-day level. You walk around the mall and there'll be Arab, she's carrying a bag from Fox. Fox is an Israeli Gap. It's a clothing store. Ordinary life is going on, but under the surface, the tension remains. Under the surface, we go all the way back to that partition plan map that nobody's entirely happy with. And that is something that makes Jerusalem a very, very complicated city. There is a third factor in who lives in Jerusalem, and we'll get to it in a second, but what connects the city is public transport. Most significantly now, the light rail. When the light rail was being built, Jerusalemites were betting that the Messiah was going to come before the light rail because it took so long to get built, but now we have it. And I like this slide because this train, the numbers, the details keep flashing through 3 different languages. So it says, it appears in English and Hebrew, and as it appears on that train in Arabic. So those populations exist side by side in the city. They exist side by side economically. They interact, but they still live in very different neighborhoods. They mostly don't go to the same schools. And their kids don't meet each other till they get to high school. And they go to some program or till they get to the job market, and working in the store for them, with them, is someone from the other side of the city. And that's a complexity that we have in the city. The other complexity, the other problem that we have, the other challenge that we have is that Jerusalem is a focus of Jewish life. And the slide that I chose here to depict that is actually of a group of women called Women of the Wall. This is a group of women who get together once a month to pray at the wall, wearing talit, wearing tefillin, reading from the Torah. And who are prevented from doing it or are hounded from doing it by ultra-Orthodox Jews. And that's another complexity that we face in Jerusalem. The slide that we have up here is on a snowstorm day, so you don't actually see that many ultra-Orthodox Jews in the picture. You don't see that many people in the picture at all. But typically, 1/3 of the population of Jerusalem are Arab. 1/3 of the population of Jerusalem are ultra-Orthodox. And 1/3 of the population of Jerusalem are everyone else. And for everyone else, that means people who self-define as modern Orthodox, people who self-define as secular, and the tiny number of people who would call themselves conservative or Reform Jews as well. And so that makes Jerusalem an especially complicated place, because who does this wall belong to? Forget about arguing with the Arabs, who are more interested in the Golden Dome, which we can just see the edge of up on top. But who does this wall belong to? Is this wall the next year in Jerusalem that Reform Jews, that traditional Jews, that conservative Jews have thought about? Or does it only belong to Orthodox Jews? That's an issue that we are dealing with, that we are talking about, that we are grappling with today. Just last week, on Jerusalem Day, the new mayor of Jerusalem, in a throwaway comment, in a non-thought-through comment, but in a trying to prop up his coalition, which is dependent on ultra-Orthodox partners, made some comment about prayer at the Western Wall being something that Reform Jews couldn't do. What he meant, of course, was as Reform Jews. Anyone who goes down on the men's side can pray there. Anyone who goes down on the woman's side can pray there, provided, of course, you're a man on the men's side or a woman on the woman's side, and not as an egalitarian place of prayer where men and women would pray together. And so I started off my presentation today by talking about this longing for Jerusalem, with this an image of the Western Wall, with the fact that we shout next year in Jerusalem, that we break the cup at our weddings, and yet, which Jerusalem is it? Which holy mountain is it? Is it this holy mountain, which of the Western Wall, which most Tel Avivim don't care for? They're more interested in Mount Herzl. They're more interested in Yad Vashem. They're more interested in the symbols of nationalism than the symbols of religion. Is it this site which bears great significance for Jews from around the world, for diaspora Jews, but from which there may be alienated from by the ultra-Orthodox establishment? It's a complicated city. The relationship between Jerusalem and the Jewish world going forward is a complicated relationship. It's made complicated by the fact that people care, by the fact that you learned about Jerusalem in Hebrew school, in preschool, at day camp, and the future of that relationship is a complicated relationship going forward. So those are the formal comments that I wanted to make, and I'll be happy. I don't know if there were any questions, Debbie, while I was talking, or if there are any coming in now.
Julie asked a question early on. She wanted to know what the artifact was that was discovered from the time of King Solomon's temple. I remember that there was an archaeological discovery, but I don't remember what it was. And if you could unshare your screen now so that we could see the faces of everyone, that would be great.
Wait, is it unshared? No, hang on. There we go.
Right. So Julie's question was about the archaeological find.
Yeah, there was small. They have found before what are called bullae, or stamps, seals, which are fired. But I understand that this was something more significant than just those simple seals, and it was found on the Temple Mount. Other finds have been found down in the city of David, which is not that far from the Temple Mount, but it was the fact that in general, there are Muslim reticence about Jews digging on the Temple Mount, but it was found in situ. It's provenanced. It's not just fine. We've previously found artifacts that we can date to the time of the temple, because then if it's a name on a stamp and it's a name that happens to be mentioned in the Bible, the chances that there were two of them that held an official title are very slight. But they were never found, it's like a piece of art that's unprovenanced. It was finding another one of these on the Temple Mount that is significant, like in situ, that is important.
Does anybody else have a question for Muki?
Is that the one that was found by the 6-year-old, or what was that?
No, that was also something significant. That was a Canaanite that was older than David or Solomon, wasn't found in Jerusalem. As far as I remember reading about that one, but I don't remember the details.
Somewhere in the Galil.
Yeah.
Muki, could you say a word? I don't know much about it, but there's a new major excavation going from Ein Kerem, I believe. It was part of the King's Highway. Is that, or I'm getting that? Something that was leading to the ancient city of David. I heard reference.
So it's not in Ein Kerem, it's in the city of David.
Oh, but I thought it came from the side of the city.
I mentioned, well, there are two different things. I'm not sure. I'm not sure which one you're referring to. I mentioned that Jerusalem becomes a focal point. And you mentioned that we will be celebrating in just for me in less than 24 hours, the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is one of 3 holidays that we call pilgrim holidays. It's kind of the less popular one of the 3. Now there's Pesach, Passover, we have the Seder, there's Sukkot, we build a sukkah, and there's Shavuot, you eat cheesecake. So kind of, the ritual is a very tasty, but not quite as dramatic as the others. All 3 of the pilgrim festivals, people came up to Jerusalem from around the land of Israel and from around the world, the known world at the time. They came up from Egypt, they came up from Greece, they came across from Greece and Rome, they came down from Babylon. These were major journeys, and there was an infrastructure in place to enable these people to come. Roads. I mean, think about when you do Maccabi, and you have to host all those people. Okay, you have to host all those people for a week or several days. So these are pilgrims that have come a long way. They've got to stay somewhere. They've got to eat something. They've got to purchase a sacrifice. They haven't come here just to look. They've come to, there's an act that has to be done. And so there's an infrastructure of roads that are in place. In the city of David, they found one of the last significant parts of the road, paved road in Jerusalem, but not from the time of David, much later in a slightly different place. And they found evidence of the roadway further out as well. If that's what I'm not sure if that was the dig that you're referring to. Interestingly, while we've been in shutdown, I'm not sure how much archaeology has been going on, but an enormous amount of construction that normally they couldn't do, or they could only do a few hours a day because people had to commute and whatever. They've been racing along with it. And of course, as soon as there's construction, there's more discoveries of archaeological sites and more excavations. I haven't even kept up with all the finds that have been found in the last few weeks. Like literally every day on the paper, there's a new find that has been found.
Anybody have a question?
Yes, I have a question. You said, first of all, thank you for the presentation. You said that the word Jerusalem was not mentioned in the Old Testament. So when was it the first time that the word Jerusalem appeared in the history?
Okay, so Jerusalem is not mentioned in the Torah. It's mentioned in the Old Testament. The Tanakh, what I call the Tanakh, what I had in the picture beforehand, is the Hebrew Bible. It's the Torah and the books of the prophets and the books of what we call the writings, the Ketuvim. Now, in Genesis, Abraham meets Melchizedek, from Ursalem. And many people say Ursalem and Jerusalem are the same place. Okay, and that will take our history of Jerusalem back later on. Otherwise, the first mention of Jerusalem is when David comes up to conquer the city in the book of Samuel. But like I said, then it makes up for it, because it becomes an enormously significant city. It's where the kings, and from then till the rest of the Bible, we have the genealogies of all these kings, son of kings, and all the books of kings and the prophets. Whether it's Isaiah or Jeremiah, they're all active in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is mentioned in lots of detail, but it's not really mentioned in Genesis. There is no, in the first 5 books. There is actually no completely verifiable historical archaeological site that's mentioned in the Torah, where we can cross-reference. Yeah, we've got Mount Nebo, we've got places, Jericho, whatever, but there is no. And then afterwards, we start having many cross-referencing of places that are mentioned in the Bible and places that we see in Israel. Remember, most of the first part of the Bible, we're either down in the desert, or we're in exile in Egypt, or we're walking through Sinai with Moses. Hardly any of the first 5 books takes place in the land of Israel. Briefly, Abraham is down around Hebron, and the other sons are the patriarchs and matriarchs are briefly in the land for 3 generations. The rest of the Torah doesn't take place in the land of Israel.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Does anybody else?
So someone wrote and asked, would it be accurate to say Herzl's willingness to accept an alternative to historical Israel was a stopgap measure to protect Jews from anti-Semitism and violence until the Zionist dream of a homeland could be fulfilled? Especially if you factor in the Kishinev pogrom. So the important thing to remember is Herzl writes der Judenstadt 7 years before the Kishinev pogroms. Herzl is absolutely looking for a solution for Jews from anti-Semitism. Herzl's very worried about violence. Herzl comes from Vienna. He's just seen Karl Lueger elected as mayor of the city on an anti-Semitic ticket. So Herzl thinks Herzl foresees bad news coming from anti-Semitism. He wants a solution. But he's not prepared. I mean, he's not emotionally connected to Jerusalem. Herzl grew up in a home where they didn't say next year in Jerusalem. Herzl grew up in a very assimilated home. Herzl, so yes, on the one hand, he is looking for a solution for the Jews in the face of anti-Semitism, but he's not looking to start something there in Uganda and then pack it up and move somewhere else. Had he managed in the frantic years between 1897 and his death in 1904, when he met with the Tsar and he met with the Kaiser and he met with whoever he could meet with in order to try and negotiate a piece of land, had one of them given him a piece of land somewhere, he would have established the Jewish state there. Whether the Jews would have packed their bags and left Poland to go and live in some godforsaken place, that's a whole separate story. Even when Zionists were coming to the land of Israel, most of them did what my grandparents did and what your grandparents did, which is went to America, went to Africa, went to Argentina. They didn't come to the land of Israel, even when it was the land of Israel. So certainly the attraction of some other place would have been less possible. I have time for another question if there is one, Debbie.
I don't see one. I'll just ask, you gave us a great presentation, historical context and political explanation, but we didn't talk much about modern Jerusalem. Just out of curiosity, what's your favorite place in today's contemporary, when you're not in the old city guiding, what's your favorite place in Jerusalem to visit? Or one of your favorite places?
My favorite place to visit in Jerusalem is one of the secondhand bookstores, but that would be in the vicinity, which are around Machane Yehuda. We didn't show any pictures of Machane Yehuda. Machane Yehuda is the Jewish market. It's the it's a, well, the truth is 10 years ago, it was only a food and produce market. 10 years ago, Machane Yehuda was a place that you went to do your shopping. Today, it's filled with restaurants and bars and some kind of boutique-y places as well. But probably that would be the place that I would go. It's a place where one goes to taste, not really. At the beginning, I said Jerusalem is a place of stories. There are not that many stories to tell in Machane Yehuda. You can't tell stories there because you're constantly putting things in your mouth, as you taste your way around the city.
Maybe on a future tour, we'll visit Machane Yehuda.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
The question is, has the construction of the U.S. Embassy started in Jerusalem?
Yes. So the United States Embassy has been open and running in Jerusalem. It's been open and running in Jerusalem for more than a year already. It's a temporary building. In other words, it's not the building where it's not on the piece of land that the United States bought 40 years ago, and where the embassy is supposed to be built, because the president made a decision. He wanted an embassy there, and they wanted it very quickly, and so they had to repurpose an existing building. And the fact is, most of the work does not happen in the embassy building. I last summer went to the United States on vacation with my family. I had not been for 10 years, which meant my visa had expired. We need visas. And it was all done through the Tel Aviv office, which says United States Embassy Branch Office on the heading. The building that stands in Jerusalem is more of a symbolic building.
But the question is, has the construction of the big structure for U.S. Embassy?
No.
They haven't started that yet?
No. As far as I know, nothing is happening with the piece of land where the new building is supposed to be.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to Muki. I know he has to go and he has to go to sleep now and then get up and prepare his cheesecake, his dairy meal for tomorrow night. I wish you, Muki, and your whole
We
family.
have 3 13-year-olds sleeping in the house tonight. I don't know how much sleep. The first sleepover since the COVID-19 thing has collapsed. I don't know how much sleep I'm going to be getting, but we'll see.
Well, make sure they all wash their hands. And I wish you Chag Sameach, Chag Shavuot Sameach to all of you. And remember, next week, we will be heading back up north. We will not back up north. We will be heading up north to the Galilee for some more beautiful views. I'm sure that there's a little bit, probably a little bit less political history to talk about and more nature to see. I'm just guessing. And we will see you back here next Wednesday at 11 o'clock. And like I said, as soon as I have as soon as we record this and upload this will be on our YouTube channel. You can go back and look at the Negev presentation from last week. Thank you all for joining us, and lehitraot.